Joining me at this time is someone who's not a jag-off. She is Patrice Lee. She joins me from New York, should I say from Washington, D.C. And Patrice is with the Independent Women's Forum. Patrice, good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. All right, so before we talk about Obamacare, I'd like to show this video of what President Obama himself is saying about the GOP vis-a-vis Obamacare.
I recognize that their party is going through, the stages of grief, right? And anger and denial and all that stuff, and we're not at acceptance yet.
So it's the GOP, Patrice, which is going through anger and denial, going through grief over Obamacare. Your take on that?
I think the president is trying to deflect the fact that still Obamacare is unpopular among a majority of Americans. It's not just conservatives that are concerned about the government's takeover of a large swath of our economy through health care, but there are serious issues that are a concern to most Americans. Yeah,
it's just ingenuous to watch the president. He should be embarrassed. He should,
yes.
As we all know, he stood up and got caught on a lie, a 3 or 4 year lie. You can keep your doctor, you can keep your health care. All right, it's behind us. He comes out and says it's embarrassing. Now, let's get into the real facts and figures. One of these things that jumps out at me when I say these things referring to facts and figures, that's something I know you're following, the so-called invincibles. The Affordable Care Act needs those people under the age of 35 to sign up to make this thing work from a financial standpoint. It needs 40% of enrollees to be under the age of 35. It's not even anywhere near there, is it, Patrice?
It's actually not. So last week when the president victoriously announced hitting 8 million enrollments, really we call them signups because we don't know how many of those people are going to pay their first month premium. But when he made that announcement, he also said something pretty disingenuous, which is that 35% of signups were under the age of 35. And that's supposed to get at the idea that young people successfully signed up for Obamacare. But what he's counting are, teenagers and preteens and little kids whose families signed them up. The real number that is really most important are the 18 through 34-year-olds. And of those, only 28% are within that demographic. And as you just mentioned, these are key. This is a key demographic to the sustainability of Obamacare over the long run. So we can expect, as the outgoing HHS Secretary Sebelius said not too long ago, that premiums are going to rise, and they are. And we've seen that in the private market, healthcare premiums for individuals and group markets have already started to spike. So we'll see more of that.
Well, that was my next question, is it can't sustain itself at those numbers. So what happens next is what you just alluded to. No, you didn't allude to it, you said it, is that the premiums will rise. Do we know what, or do we have an idea of what size or significance they will rise in?
We don't know that yet, and it's probably a little too early to speculate that, but I think as some of the health insurers start to conduct their own surveys, and they'll probably release some of those numbers, so we'll be able to have a better sense of that. Now, the Kaiser Foundation, which does specialize in healthcare studies, they have said that, the amount of young people in the system currently should be enough, but I'm not too sure. We'll see what happens when the healthcare industry insurers start to report on what their plans are for 2015 and beyond.
Now, in the previous segment, we mentioned that today is Tax Freedom Day, and that and we talked about entitlements in society and so forth. It turns out that only 1.4 million, according to the numbers I've seen, only 1.4 million of the previously uninsured individuals are now insured under Obamacare, yet we have a $2 trillion price tag. It seems to me that the American people are not getting their money's worth on this.
Well, it's very interesting. You're alluding to an important statistic coming out of RAND. And really, when we look at the reasons why the president said we needed to adopt Obamacare and we needed reform, and specifically his reform plan, he referred to the fact that uninsured Americans would be insured through Obamacare. Well, as you mentioned, we've got at least a third of new signups who were not previously uninsured. So that means that 2/3 were insured. and there were probably people who were kicked off of their previous insurance plans because of Obamacare. You know, at the end of the day, the president talks about this being a done deal and it's over and we need to move on. But there are plenty of people out there who are moving on with higher health care costs, who are moving on, who are going to actually not be able to be hired by employers because employers can't afford to hire new people. We're moving on to a system and a country and an economy that's really not growing because employers are experiencing higher costs. They're experiencing just the inability to really grow their companies because of Obamacare. And, you know, at IWF, we've been tracking a lot of these stories recently and lately, and it's just staggering to see the impact that Obamacare is having. So hopefully the president will take that and see that we're not just ready to move on and accept it as is.
And Patrice, when I listen to your answer and I hear you say things like employer and staggering cost and so forth, the one thing which has not even occurred yet in the Obama administration does not want to talk about is the employer mandate. I mean, that's going to have huge consequences, impact on society, on the job market. That hasn't even hit yet.
That's right. That's right, and it was delayed, interestingly, after the midterm elections, and it delayed. I mean, there have been several delays, really, but the idea is that hopefully by delaying, Americans would have already swallowed this pill and would be okay with it. But you know, we're going to continue to stand on our soapbox and say, you know what, Americans deserve better. There have always been private options, and there always will be private options that are more than likely better. The fact that the government has to subsidize Americans to actually take Obamacare says something about the plan itself. It's a faulty plan and it's a bad deal.
All right, well, listen, Patrice Lee, we thank you for joining us. We want to hit on those two quick topics, because when I say topics, those key statistics that you provided detail on. One, the 18 to age 34 age group, and the other, the number of uninsured, because that's something that's important. It's critical for this thing to work or not work, and the White House simply isn't talking about it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. It's time for the midterm countdown. Up next,